Saren had spent 3 days on the cake, 3 days of sifting flour until her arms ached. 3 days of tempering sugar into spun gold and shaping fondant roses so delicate they looked like they might bruise if you breathed on them. The cake was 5 tiers tall, laced with honeycomb and wild lavender, and it was, without question, the most beautiful thing she had ever created. It was also the heaviest. Her arms trembled as she carried it down the corridor toward the great hall, the edges of the silver platter biting into her palms. She could hear the feast already, the low roar of voices, the clinking of goblets. And somewhere beneath it all, music that she would never be close enough to enjoy properly. Tonight was the Alpha King's 29th birthday. The last birthday before the Accord of Succession forced him to name a mate, or surrender the choice to his council. Every eligible woman of rank had spent weeks preparing. Gowns had been commissioned. Alliances had been whispered into existence over candlelit dinners. The entire court was holding its breath. Saren was not holding her breath. Saren was holding a cake and trying not to trip on the uneven stones. She was nobody, a foundling raised in the palace kitchens. Flour under her nails and sugar in her hair, invisible to everyone who mattered. The only reason she was anywhere near this feast was because the head cook had burned his hand that morning, and someone needed to carry the centerpiece, and Saren made the centerpiece, so here she was. She turned the corner toward the service entrance and stopped. Voices drifted through the archway ahead. She recognized them immediately. Lord Calder's smooth, easy laughter, and beside it, the deeper tones of Lord Fenwick and Lord Hale, two of his constant companions. "Be serious," Fenwick was saying. "The kitchen girl has been following you around like a lost pup for months. Half the staff thinks you're courting her." Saren's stomach clenched. She should have kept walking, should have turned around and found another entrance, but her feet wouldn't move. Calder laughed again, and the sound was different now. Not warm, not kind. The laugh of a man performing for an audience. "Courting her?" Calder repeated. "Come now." She was a pleasant distraction, sweet, eager, remarkably easy to flatter, but I'll never choose her. She's a foundling with flour on her hands and no name worth speaking. My bloodline deserves better than a kitchen girl who thinks a smile means a promise. The words hit her like a closed fist. Saren stood frozen in the corridor, the 5-tier cake trembling in her hands, and felt something inside her chest crack open and go cold. Every stolen conversation, every time he had lingered at the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame with that easy grin, telling her she was clever, telling her she was different, every time she had believed him. Lies. All of it, a pleasant distraction, her vision blurred, the platter tilted dangerously, and she caught it with a sharp jerk that sent one of the fondant roses tumbling to the floor. The soft sound of it hitting stone was barely a whisper. But it was enough. The voices stopped. Calder appeared in the archway. His smile faltered when he saw her face. When he read the devastation written across it and understood that she had heard every word. "Saren," he started. Behind him, Fenwick had the decency to look uncomfortable. Hale did not. "Saren, I did not mean," Calder tried again. "You meant every word," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted, steadier than she expected. The silence that followed was the worst kind. The kind that fills a space where an apology should be but isn't. Calder opened his mouth, closed it. His gaze dropped to the cake in her trembling hands, then back to her face, and she watched him make the calculation. The flicker of guilt weighed against the presence of his peers, and the peers won. They always won. "Perhaps," he said carefully. "This isn't the place." "No," Saren agreed, her throat burning. "It isn't." She stepped forward because the cake still needed to reach the great hall, and the world did not stop turning just because hers had. She moved past Calder without looking at him, through the archway, and into the blinding light and noise of the feast. The great hall swallowed her whole. Hundreds of voices, candles blazing from the court in all its terrifying, glittering glory. And at the center of it, raised above the rest on a dais carved from black stone, sat the Alpha King. Saren had never been this close to him before. The rumors painted him as a monster, the butcher of Ashenmere, the wolf who had ended the border wars through sheer, relentless brutality. She expected cruelty in his face. What she found instead was exhaustion. He sat perfectly still, watching the court with dark eyes that reflected the candlelight like a frozen lake. His skin was pale in a way that looked wrong on a man so broad and powerful. He looked cold, not aloof, physically cold. She set the cake at the foot of his table, straightened up, and the king's gaze found hers. It lasted less than a second. A glance, nothing more. But in that fraction of a moment, something happened that she could not explain. A pull deep and sudden, like a hook behind her ribs. Her skin flushed warm, and the warmth traveled outward from her chest in a wave that felt enormous and impossible to contain. Theron's eyes widened slightly. His hand resting on the arm of his chair twitched. Then Saren looked away, stepped back, and the moment ended. Behind her, the court continued its relentless noise. She heard the council's chief advisor, Lord Pemberton, rise to address the crowd. His voice carried the particular gravity of a man who had been rehearsing. Your Majesty, the accord of succession requires that before the close of your 29th year, you name your intended mate, or the council shall name one in your stead. The court presents its candidates for your consideration. One by one, women stepped forward. Noble daughters in silk and jewels, the king watched each one with the same flat, exhausted expression. He said nothing. Saren was already backing toward the service door when Calder's voice rose from one of the lower tables. What about the kitchen girl? He said. It was meant as a joke. A cruel, careless throwaway designed to get a laugh from his companions. Saren felt every head in the hall turn toward her. She froze mid-step, her back to the room. She presented the cake quite nicely, Calder continued, enjoying himself now. Fennec snickered beside him. Perhaps she'd like to present herself as a candidate. Laughter rippled through the nearest tables. The sound washed over Saren like ice water. She closed her eyes and willed herself to keep moving, to keep walking, to disappear back into the kitchens where she belonged and never come out again. Then Lord Hale added, loud enough for the room to hear, would anyone ever choose a foundling with flour on her hands? The laughter spread. I'll never choose her, Calder declared, raising his goblet with a grin that made Saren's stomach turn. And I suspect no one else will either. The hall erupted. And in the middle of that eruption, a voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk. I will. The laughter died. Every head turned toward the dais. King Theron Valdris was on his feet. His dark eyes were fixed on Calder with an intensity that made the lords' grin dissolve into something closer to terror. I will choose her, the king repeated. His voice was low and absolute, and left no room for misunderstanding. The silence that fell across the great hall was so complete that Saren could hear her own heartbeat. She turned slowly, the cake platter still warm where it had rested in her hands moments ago, and stared at the Alpha King. He was looking at her now, not through her, not past her, at her, and in his eyes she saw something she could not name. Something desperate and certain and utterly terrifying. Your Majesty, Lord Pemberton stammered, surely you cannot be serious. Record it. The king said, still looking at Saren. She is my choice. The room exploded into whispered chaos. Saren stood alone in the middle of it, her pulse roaring in her ears, her hands still dusted with flour, and tried to understand how a night that had started with a broken heart had ended, with a king saying her name. The morning after the feast, Saren woke in a room she did not recognize. It was small but clean, with pale stone walls and a window that overlooked the eastern gardens. The bed was softer than anything she had ever slept on, the sheets crisp and white, and for a disorienting moment she lay perfectly still and tried to remember how she had gotten here. Then it came flooding back, Calder's voice, the laughter, the king standing. I will choose her. Saren pressed her face into the pillow and made a sound that was half groan and half prayer. A knock came at the door before she could spiral further. Miss Saren? A woman's voice, calm and professional. The king's beta requests your presence. Saren dressed in a daze, pulling on the only clean clothes she had, her kitchen uniform, and followed the attendant through corridors she had never walked before. The upper levels of the palace were quieter than the bustling kitchens below. Everything smelled of polished wood and old money. The Beta's office was a narrow room lined with maps and correspondence. Hadrian Voss stood behind a desk cluttered with documents, his posture as precise as a drawn bow. He was lean and sharp-featured, the kind of man who noticed everything and said only what was necessary. When Saren entered, he studied her the way a scholar might study an unusual specimen. "Sit," he said. Saren sat. "You have questions?" Hadrian observed. "I have about 400 questions," Saren replied, her voice tight. Starting with what happened last night and ending with, "Why am I not back in the kitchen right now?" The corner of Hadrian's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. "What happened last night is that the king exercised his right under the accord of succession to name his intended mate. He named you. This is legally binding and cannot be reversed without his abdication or your formal refusal before the council." Saren blinked at him. "I'm sorry," she said slowly. "His intended what?" "Mate," Hadrian repeated, as though he were discussing the weather. "But he doesn't know me. We have never spoken." I handed him a cake, and he looked at me for half a second. "And yet here we are." Hadrian folded his hands on the desk. "I should be transparent with you, Miss Saren. The king's decision surprised the council. It surprised me. But I have served Theron Valdres for 9 years, and I have never seen him act impulsively. If he chose you, there is a reason. Even if he has not shared it." Saren's hands twisted in her lap. What reason could he possibly have? Hadrian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze measuring. "The king is unwell," said. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. "What do you mean unwell?" Hadrian moved to the window and stood with his back to her, his voice dropping to something low and careful. "What I tell you does not leave this room. The court believes the king is simply reserved, cold in temperament. The truth is more literal than they know." He turned to face her. 3 years ago, during the Ashenmere campaign, the king defeated an enemy alpha named Drostan. Drostan's mother was a practitioner of old magic. As her son died, she cursed Theron. The curse is physical. His body temperature has been falling steadily ever since. His hands are ice. His wolf is growing sluggish. The palace healers have tried everything, and nothing has worked. Saren felt the floor tilt beneath her. "How long does he have?" she asked. 8 months, perhaps less. The cold is moving inward. When it reaches his heart, he will die. "And you're telling me this because," Saren managed. "Because when you approached the dais last night," the king's hand warmed. For the first time in 3 years, the temperature in his right hand rose by several degrees. He felt it. I saw it in his face. Saren's breath caught. She remembered the pull behind her ribs, the wave of warmth. "That is not possible," she whispered. "And yet it happened," Hadrian replied. "His wolf recognized something in you that his mind hadn't caught up to yet. So he chose me because I'm some kind of cure?" A crack appeared in Hadrian's carefully neutral expression. Something that might have been sympathy. "I don't know why he chose you. I only know that you're the first thing that has made any difference at all. The king has requested a meeting with you this afternoon. He wants to propose an arrangement." "An arrangement," Saren repeated. "A practical one. You would spend time in his presence daily, close proximity. The healers want to observe whether your effect on him is consistent, and the mate declaration buys time. The council cannot force a different match while the king's intention is formally recorded." "And if I refuse?" she asked quietly. "Then you return to the kitchen, no consequences. This is not a command." But even as he said it, Saren heard the unspoken truth. If she refused, the king would die. She would go back to her flour and her sugar and her invisible existence, and somewhere above her, a man she had never spoken to would grow colder and colder until his heart stopped. "When is the meeting?" she asked. 2 hours, Hadrian replied. "Someone will bring you appropriate clothes." "I have appropriate clothes." Hadrian's gaze traveled down her flour-dusted kitchen uniform and back up to her face. "Someone will bring you appropriate clothes," he repeated. The meeting was held in the king's private study. Saren was led inside by a guard who closed the door behind her and left her standing alone on a carpet that probably cost more than everything she had ever owned combined. The study should have been warm. A fire blazed in the hearth and heavy curtains blocked the drafts. But a chill hung in the air that had everything to do with the man sitting behind The desk. King Theron Valdris looked worse in daylight. The shadows beneath his eyes were darker than at the feast. His hands, resting flat on the desk, were so pale they looked almost blue, and yet he was still devastatingly handsome, a raw, brutal beauty that made it hard to think clearly. The gray-black gaze that lifted to meet hers was unreadable. "Miss Saren," he said. His voice was quiet, controlled, and colder than she remembered. "Your Majesty." A beat of silence. "Sit down," he said, and she did, choosing the chair farthest from him. His gaze tracked the distance she put between them, and his expression briefly tightened. "Hadrian told you," he said. "It was not a question. About the curse, yes." Another silence. "Then you understand that last night was not romantic," the king said. "It was strategic. My wolf reacted to your presence in a way I cannot explain, and I made a decision in the moment to protect myself from the council's interference." He paused. "I apologize for the spectacle. It was not my intention to embarrass you." Saren blinked at him. Of all the things she had expected him to say, an apology was not among them. "You didn't embarrass me," she said. "Lord Calder handled that part." The king's jaw tightened at the name. "Calder is a fool." "He is," Saren agreed, surprised by how easily she said it. "But that doesn't explain why I'm here." Theron studied her for a long moment, his gaze steady and unreadable. "I need you near me," he said finally. The words came out stiff, reluctant, like they had been dragged from somewhere deep. "Your proximity produces an effect on the curse that nothing else has achieved. I don't know why. The healers don't know why. But I am running out of time, and I am not above asking for help." Saren watched his hands on the desk, the faint blue tinge to his fingers. The way he held them perfectly still, as though movement might reveal how much they were shaking. "You're not asking," she said gently. "You're explaining. There's a difference." He frowned. "Is there? Asking sounds like this. Will you help me?" The king held her gaze. His throat worked. Something raw and vulnerable flickered behind those cold, careful eyes. And for just a moment she glimpsed the man beneath the title, exhausted, frightened, running out of time and trying very hard not to show it. "Will you help me?" he asked. Saren felt the pull again, that deep, magnetic tug behind her ribs that defied logic and reason and every survival instinct screaming at her to run. "Yes," she said. The king exhaled slowly. The tension in his shoulders didn't ease, but his hands relaxed by a fraction on the desk. "Then we begin tomorrow," he said. "Hadrian will arrange the details." Saren stood to leave. At the door, she paused. He looked up. "Happy birthday," she said. For the briefest moment, something warm crossed his face. Then it was gone. "Thank you, Miss Saren." She left his study with her heart beating much too fast, and the certainty that she had just agreed to something far larger than either of them understood. The arrangement began simply enough. Each morning, Saren reported to the king's study at the 8th bell. She sat in a chair near the window, close enough for her presence to register, but far enough to maintain propriety, and she stayed for 4 hours while Theron worked. The first day was excruciating. Saren sat rigid in her chair, hands folded, staring at the wall, acutely aware of every breath she took. The king read reports, signed documents, and consulted with advisors who entered and exited in a steady stream. He did not look at her. He did not speak to her. She might as well have been a piece of furniture, but she could feel the cold. It radiated from him like heat radiates from a forge, except inverted. A tangible absence of warmth that pressed against her skin and made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. Every instinct in her body told her to move closer, to reach out, to bridge the gap, and she had no idea why. After 3 hours, the head healer arrived. Vedra was a tall woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe knot and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She carried a leather case filled with instruments Saren did not recognize and approached the king with the easy familiarity of someone who had been doing this for years. "Hand," Vedra said. The king extended his right hand without looking up from his work. Vedra pressed her fingers to his wrist, then produced a small glass instrument and held it against his palm. 1 degree higher than yesterday," she announced. Saren watched the exchange, fascinated. Vedra turned to study her, gaze sharp and assessing. "How close has she been sitting?" the healer asked Hadrian, who stood by the door like a particularly well-dressed sentinel. 8 feet, approximately, Hadrian replied. Move her to 4, Vedra said, and keep notes on the variance. I can hear you, Saren pointed out. Vedra turned the full weight of her attention on her, and Saren immediately wished she had stayed quiet. Good, the healer said. Then hear this. Whatever you are doing, do more of it. I'm sitting in a chair. Then sit closer. They moved her chair, 4 feet from the king's desk. Close enough now that she could see the documents he was reading. Close enough to hear the scratch of his pen. Close enough to notice the way his handwriting deteriorated toward the bottom of each page, as though his fingers were going numb. She didn't mention it. She sat and watched, and tried not to stare at the way the firelight caught the angles of his face. By the 3rd day, Saren was bored out of her mind. She had never been good at sitting still. Her hands ached for something to do, for dough to knead, for sugar to spin, for any kind of productive work. Instead, she sat in a chair and existed, which as a job description left something to be desired. You're fidgeting, the king said without looking up. Saren froze. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her since the arrangement began. Sorry, she murmured. Another silence stretched between them, filled only by the scratch of his pen. If you need something to occupy your hands, he said slowly, still not looking up. There are books on the 3rd shelf. Saren glanced at the shelf in question and felt a small, unexpected flutter of gratitude. Thank you, Your Majesties. Theron, he said. She blinked. What? If you are going to sit 4 feet from me every day for the foreseeable future, you may as well use my name. Saren watched the back of his head. He had not looked up once during the entire exchange, but she could see the faintest flush at the tips of his ears. Theron, she said, testing it. The name felt warm in her mouth, significant, like speaking it aloud had changed the shape of the air between them. He cleared his throat and turned a page. Saren got a book. The days settled into a rhythm. Mornings in the study, afternoons free. Vedra took measurements daily. The king's hand temperature rose. The blue tinge in his fingers receded. His wolf was more responsive than it had been in months. But each evening when Saren left, the cold crept back. By morning, much of the progress had reversed. Vedra's mouth grew thinner with each measurement. The curse is aggressive, Vedra told Saren one afternoon. Your presence slows it, but the moment you leave, it reasserts. We are barely staying ahead. What would happen if I stayed longer? Saren asked. Continuously. Vedra gave her a long, measured look. Significantly better results. But continuous exposure means sleeping in his chambers. And that carries implications I am not comfortable making on your behalf. Saren's face heated. It would be purely medical. Of course it would, Vedra replied, but the court would not see it that way, and neither would your wolf. Saren frowned. My wolf? Vedra studied her for a moment too long. Nothing, forget I mentioned it. But Saren couldn't forget. That night, she lay awake thinking about the pull, that maddening gravity that tugged at her whenever she was near him. The way her wolf had begun stirring restlessly beneath her skin every time she entered his study. She dreamed of ice spreading across a frozen lake, of his voice calling her name from far away, growing fainter until it disappeared entirely. She woke gasping and sat in the dark until her heartbeat slowed. The next morning, she arrived at the study early. Theron was already there, which surprised her. He was standing by the window with his back to the room, his hands clasped behind him. In the pale morning light, she could see his breath. His breath was visible inside the room, by a lit fireplace. Theron, she said, alarmed. He turned. The hollows beneath his eyes had deepened overnight. His lips had a faint blue cast that hadn't been there yesterday, and when he moved, his motions were slower, more deliberate, as though his joints had stiffened. It was a difficult night, he said, and the understatement was so vast it was almost funny. Saren crossed the room without thinking. She stopped directly in front of him, closer than she had ever stood, close enough to feel the cold pouring off him in waves. She reached up and pressed her palm against his cheek. His skin was like marble. Theron went utterly still, his eyes closed, and beneath her hand she felt it, a slow, gradual warming, like sunlight creeping across stone. The blue faded from his lips. The rigid line of his shoulders softened by a fraction. A sound escaped him. Low and involuntary, something between relief and pain, and his hand came up to cover hers, pressing her palm harder against his face as though he were afraid she might pull away. "Don't," he murmured. "I'm not going anywhere." Saren whispered. They stood like that for a long time, his hand over hers, his eyes closed, the cold slowly retreating from his skin. When he finally opened his eyes, they were brighter than she had ever seen them, and the raw gratitude in his expression made her chest ache. "I'm going to suggest something," Saren said carefully, "and I need you to hear the practical reasoning before you say no." His brow furrowed. "I think I need to stay overnight," she continued. "In your chambers. The curse resets every evening when I leave. If I stay through the night, we could gain real ground instead of facing the same battle every morning." His expression shuddered instantly. His hand dropped from hers. The mask slid back into place. "No," he said. "The practical reasoning," Saren started. "I heard the practical reasoning. The answer is no. Vedra agrees with me. Then Vedra can sleep in my chambers. I doubt Vedra's presence would have the same effect." "It's inappropriate," Theron said, his voice hardening. "The court already whispers about you. If word spreads that you're spending nights in the king's rooms, your reputation will be destroyed." Saren looked at him, this proud, stubborn, freezing man who was slowly dying and still more worried about her reputation than his survival. "My reputation was destroyed the moment you said 'I will' at your birthday feast," she told him. "The court has been calling me the king's kitchen girl for 2 weeks. Sleeping in a separate bed in your chambers is not going to make that worse." His jaw worked. She could see the argument building behind his eyes, the refusal taking shape, and beneath it, the exhaustion of a man who had been fighting a losing war against his own body for longer than anyone should have to. "One night," he said finally, the words coming out through clenched teeth, "as a trial, and you will sleep on the opposite side of the room." Saren nodded, keeping her expression carefully neutral despite the way her heart was hammering. That evening, as a guard led her through the upper corridors toward the king's chambers, Saren realized her hands were trembling, not from cold, from something much more dangerous: anticipation. The king's chambers were enormous. Heavy tapestries lined the walls. A fireplace tall enough to stand in dominated one side, and in the center of it all, impossible to ignore, sat the bed, absurdly large, piled with furs and dark linens. A narrow cot had been set up near the far wall, one thin blanket, a pillow borrowed from a supply closet, cozy. Saren muttered. Theron stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, dressed in a loose shirt and dark trousers, more casual than she had ever seen him, and the informality made everything feel suddenly, alarmingly real. "The cot should be adequate," he said stiffly. "It's perfect," Saren lied. "So," Saren said brightly, "what do you normally do before bed?" Theron frowned at her like the question was a trap. "I work." "Of course you do." She moved to the cot and sat down, bouncing slightly to test the mattress. It did not bounce. It was roughly the consistency of a cutting board. "And then you try to sleep," she continued. "And then the cold gets worse. And you lie there freezing until morning. Is that about right?" His expression told her it was exactly right. "Well," Saren said, pulling her feet up and tucking them beneath her, "tonight you have company. So maybe try to enjoy the novelty." "I don't enjoy novelty," Theron said. Shocking. Something flickered in his eyes, not quite amusement. More like surprise that someone had dared to be flippant with him. He crossed to the bed and sat on the edge with the careful deliberation of a man who expected the furniture to betray him. He picked up a report from the nightstand and began reading. Saren lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling. Minutes passed. The fire popped and settled. She could hear his breathing from across the room, steady and controlled, and beneath it something else. A faint sound, like the creak of wood contracting in winter. It took her a moment to realize it was him, the cold tightening in his chest audible in the quiet. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly. The rustling of pages stopped. "Sometimes," he said. "Like right now?" A pause. "Yes." Saren turned her head to look at him. He was staring at the report, but his eyes weren't moving. His fingers gripped the pages too tightly. "Will you tell me about it?" she asked. Not the political version, the real one. What does it feel like? For a long time, he didn't answer. She thought maybe she had pushed too far, crossed some invisible line that separated acceptable questions from unforgivable ones. Then he set the report down. It feels like drowning, he said, slowly, like standing in a river that's rising an inch at a time. Some days I can barely feel my hands. Some nights the cold reaches my chest and I can't breathe properly, and everywhere, always, this pressure, like being held under ice. His voice was flat, clinical. He could have been describing someone else's symptoms, except that his knuckles were white where they gripped the edge of the mattress. Something pulled tight inside her. She wanted to go to him, to press her hands against his skin and push the cold back. But he was the king and she was a baker on a borrowed cot, and the distance between them felt both too large and far too small. The drowning feeling, she said carefully. Does it happen in your sleep too? Theron's jaw tightened. I don't discuss that. You just discuss the waking version. The waking version is manageable. And the sleeping version isn't? Silence. Theron. He looked at her. In the firelight, his eyes were dark wells. And for a moment she saw something at the bottom of them that frightened her. Not anger. Something older. Something that looked like resignation. Go to sleep, Saren, he said quietly. She let it go, for now. She lay in the dark and listened to him breathe. Listened to the fire settle into embers. Listened to the clock mark the passing minutes with mechanical indifference. She couldn't sleep. The cot was uncomfortable, yes, but that wasn't the reason. The pull was stronger here, in his space, surrounded by his scent. Pine and frost and something deeper, something that made her wolf press forward against the boundaries of her skin with a restlessness she had never felt before. An hour passed, maybe more. Theron's breathing remained steady but never deepened. He was awake too. Then, without warning, the temperature dropped. Not gradually, not the slow creep she had grown accustomed to. This was sudden and violent, like someone had torn a hole in the wall and let winter flood in. Saren's breath crystallized in front of her face. Frost bloomed across the window glass in spiraling patterns. Theron? She gasped, sitting up. He was rigid on the bed, his body locked in a posture of absolute stillness. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing, and his skin had gone the color of ash. Saren threw off her blanket and crossed the room. She reached for his hand and recoiled. His skin was so cold it burned. Theron, can you hear me? Nothing. He stared through her like she wasn't there. Frost was forming on the sheets around him, crystallizing in delicate patterns that spread outward from his body like living things. Saren grabbed his hand despite the pain and held on. The cold seared into her palm, up her wrist, into her forearm, a vicious, biting agony that made her want to scream. But beneath it, she felt the pull, stronger than ever, a desperate primal demand to hold on, to not let go, to pour every ounce of warmth she had into this man who was freezing from the inside out. So she did. She climbed onto the bed, pressed both hands against his chest, and held on. The cold fought her like a current, a relentless force that wanted to drag him under. Her teeth chattered, her vision blurred. For a terrifying instant, she felt reality thin and stretch, and through the gap she glimpsed something. A vast, frozen landscape, endless white, a figure on his knees in the snow. Then Theron gasped. His hand shot up and grabbed her wrist with desperate force. The cold shattered like glass, and warmth flooded back into the room. So suddenly her ears popped. They stared at each other, both panting, both shaking. What was that? Saren demanded. Theron's grip on her wrist didn't loosen. A bad night, he said roughly. That was not just a bad night. I saw something. A frozen place, snow and ice and shapes in the ground. You were there. You were on your knees. His face went blank. The mask came down so fast it was like watching a door slam shut. You need to go back to your cot, he said. I'm not going anywhere, Saren. I just held your heart together with my bare hands while frost grew on your sheets, Theron. You do not get to shut me out and pretend that was normal. His eyes locked on hers. Her hands were still pressed against his chest, and beneath them she could feel his heartbeat, strong and steady now, could feel the warmth spreading from her palms into his skin like water soaking into parched earth. We will discuss it in the morning, he said finally. Promise me. His jaw clenched. I promise. She started to pull his hands away. His grip tightened on her wrist. Stay, he said. Then, as though the word had cost him something enormous. Here, stay here. Saren looked at the bed, looked at him, looked at the cot across the room. Are you asking me to sleep in your bed? I am asking you to stay close enough that if it happens again, you won't cross the room from first. The logic was sound, irrefutably sound. And it still made her pulse race. She lay down beside him, careful to maintain distance, her body rigid with the effort of not touching him. His senses surrounded her, and every fiber of her being wanted to move closer. You are very tense, Theron observed. You are very perceptive. Saren replied through clenched teeth. A pause. Thank you, he said quietly. For what you did tonight. You don't have to thank me. Yes, I do. No one has ever, he stopped. It has never stopped that quickly before. The admission hung between them, heavy with everything he wasn't saying. Saren turned her head slightly toward him. In the dying firelight, she could see his profile, the strong line of his nose, the sharp cut of his jaw, the way his lashes cast shadows against his cheekbones. He was staring at the ceiling, and his expression was open in a way she had never seen. Stripped of the mask, stripped of the title, just a man in the dark who was afraid of what happened when he closed his eyes. I'll be here, Saren whispered. If it comes back, I'll be right here. His hand found hers between them, his fingers laced through hers, careful and deliberate, and the contact sent warmth flooding up her arm and into her chest. His grip was steady. Certain. I know, he said. She lay awake long after his breathing changed, long after the tension in his body finally released and sleep pulled him under. She watched the firelight play across the ceiling and felt his hand in hers and listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing. Deep and even and peaceful, and beneath her skin her wolf paced and pressed and yearned toward him with a ferocity that terrified her. Because Saren was beginning to understand something that she was not ready to understand. Something that had nothing to do with curses or arrangements or practical medical necessity. She was beginning to understand that when the king had said, I will, he might not have known what he was really saying. But her wolf did. Something shifted after that night. Not between them, exactly. The distance remained. The formality persisted, but underneath it, like a current running beneath frozen water, something had changed. Saren felt it every time their hands touched. Every time she woke in the dark and found his fingers still laced through hers. Every time his breathing steadied into something peaceful, and the tension drained from his shoulders, and she thought, I did that. I gave him that. The cot was abandoned within 3 days. Neither of them acknowledged it. The practical logic was irrefutable. When she slept across the room, the cold crept back by midnight. When she slept beside him, it stayed away until morning. Close proximity was the treatment. The bed was simply the most efficient delivery method. That was the story Saren told herself. It was a very good story. It did not explain why her heart raced every evening when she crossed the threshold of his chambers. It did not explain why the scent of him, pine and frost, and that deeper unnamed thing had become so necessary that its absence during the day left her hollow. And it certainly did not explain what happened on the 5th night. Saren was asleep, properly, deeply asleep in a way she had only learned to achieve in his bed, surrounded by his warmth, lulled by the steady rhythm of his breathing. She didn't know what woke her, only that one moment she was dreaming of sugarwork and candlelight, and the next she was aware of his arm wrapped around her waist, and his chest pressed against her back, and his face buried in her hair. She stopped breathing. He was asleep. She could tell by the depth and rhythm of his breathing, by the heaviness of his arm, by the way his body curved around hers with an unconscious possessiveness that made her stomach flip. His hand rested flat against her ribs, fingers spread wide, holding her against him like she was something precious that might vanish if he let go. And he was warm, not the fragile, borrowed warmth she had been feeding him for days. This was real, radiating outward from his skin with an intensity that made her flush. Everywhere they touched, heat bloomed, and her wolf surged forward with a yearning so fierce it stole her breath. Saren lay perfectly still and tried to think rational thoughts. This was medical. This was proximity. a natural biological response to sustained physical contact with an alpha whose body was starving for warmth. It meant nothing. His hand shifted in sleep, sets against his hip. The contact sent warmth flooding through her, and her breath caught in her throat before she could stop it. Thurin stirred. She felt the moment consciousness returned. The slight hitch in his breathing, the way his body went rigid as he registered the position they were in. His arm tightened around her. A reflexive squeeze that lasted one thundering heartbeat. 2, 3. Then he was gone. He pulled away so abruptly the mattress rocked. Saren heard him cross the room, heard the splash of water from the basin. Heard him breathing like a man, trying very hard to get himself under control. She lay in the empty warmth he had left behind and pressed her face into the pillow and tried not to feel the ache of his absence like a physical wound. Neither of them spoke about it in the morning, but the nights continued and the pattern repeated. No matter how carefully they arranged themselves with a proper distance between them, by morning she was in his arms. It happened the same way every time, always initiated by him in sleep, always unconscious, always achingly tender. He would reach for her in the dark and pull her close, and his wolf would settle, and the cold would retreat. And for a few hours he was simply a man holding a woman, and the curse couldn't touch him. Vedra noticed. Of course Vedra noticed. His temperature readings are the highest they have been in 3 years, the healer told Saren during a private consultation. Whatever is happening at night is working significantly better than daytime proximities alone. Saren examined her hands with intense focus. We're sleeping, that's all. Vedra made a sound that communicated more skepticism than a single syllable should be able to contain. The data suggests that direct physical contact produces the strongest reversal, Vedra continued carefully. Skin contact specifically. Saren's face ignited. Vedra, I am reporting clinical findings. What you do with that information is entirely your own business. Saren left the healer's quarters with her cheeks burning. She was not going to think about skin contact. She was not going to think about the way his hand felt against her hip, or the sound he made each morning when he woke and realized how close they were. She was absolutely not going to think about any of that. That evening, Thirant was waiting for her in his chambers with an expression she had not seen before, something between determination and dread. Vedra spoke with me this afternoon, he said. Of course she did, Saren thought. We need to discuss boundaries, Theron continued, his voice carefully controlled. The current arrangement is becoming complicated. Saren's heart sank. Complicated how? He looked at her. And for one unguarded moment, she saw everything, the hunger, the restraint. The war between what he wanted and what he believed he was allowed to have. I cannot keep waking up holding you, he said, the words rough and low. And pretend it is purely medical. The admission cracked the air between them wide open. Saren stood in the doorway, her blood rushing hot and fast. The pull between them taut as a wire. Then don't pretend, she said softly. His jaw clenched. You don't understand what you're asking. I think I understand exactly what I'm asking. Saren, her arm came out strained. If we cross that line, there is no going back. Not for me. Not for my wolf. She took a step toward him. He took a step back, and the retreat was so unlike him. So fundamentally wrong for a man who had faced armies without flinching, that it told her everything she needed to know about how much this frightened him. Why are you afraid of this? She asked. Because I cannot lose you, he said, and the words tore out of him like they had been ripped from somewhere deep and bleeding. I cannot let you in and then watch this curse take me from you. I will not do that to you. She looked at him across the room, this impossible, stubborn, self-sacrificing man who would rather freeze to death than risk hurting her. Before she could respond, the temperature plummeted. It came without warning, just like before. The air crystallized. Frost erupted across the windows, and Theron's eyes went blank. No, Saren breathed. Not now. She lunged for him, grabbed his hands, and the cold seared through her palms. But this time it was worse. This time the room didn't just get cold. It disappeared. The frozen landscape slammed into her vision, endless white, a sky the color of iron. And everywhere, rising from the snow, figures encased in ice, soldiers, wolves frozen mid-stride, faces locked in expressions of horror and pain. And at the center of it all, Theron on his knees, staring at a young soldier barely more than a boy, frozen with one hand reaching upward. Theron, take my hand, we need to leave. The wind picked up, carrying voices, hundreds of them, whispering from inside the ice, growing louder. She grabbed his arm and pulled. The world cracked, fractured, reassembled. They slammed back into the bedroom, gasping. Theron's weight half collapsed against her, his breathing ragged and broken. "I'm here," Saren whispered, wrapping her arms around him despite the pain. "I'm right here." He clung to her like she was the only solid thing in a world made of ice. And in the cold dark of his chambers, the king shook apart in her arms. But hours later, when dawn crept gray and thin through the frosted windows, Theron's face had changed. The devastation was gone. In its place was something harder, something resolved. "You were there," he said. His voice was flat. "In the frost, you followed me in. I too," Sarensen started. "You could have been trapped. But I wasn't. This time." He stood, pulling away from her, and the distance he put between them felt deliberate and cruel. "It ends tonight. The arrangement is over. You will return to your own quarters." Searson felt the words like a blade between her ribs. "Theron, please. This is not a discussion." He would not look at her. His hands were clenched at his sides, and she could see them trembling. "I will not drag you into that place. I will not risk your life to save mine. You don't get to make that choice for me. I am the king," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "I get to make every choice." He walked to the door and opened it. The message was clear. Saren rose slowly, her body aching, her chest hollow with a pain that had nothing to do with cold. She walked past him without a word. At the threshold, she stopped. "You're going to die," she said quietly. "Without me beside you, the curse will finish what it started. You know that." He said nothing. His knuckles were white on the door handle. "And you'd rather die than let me help you," she whispered, "because you think you deserve it." His breath hitched. She saw the impact of the words land across his face like a blow. Then the door closed between them. The cold came back for him on the first night. Saren knew because she felt it. Lying in her borrowed room 2 floors below his chambers, she woke at midnight with ice in her veins and a terror so profound it could not possibly have been her own. The sensation was foreign and intimate at the same time, like hearing someone scream through a wall, muffled but unmistakable. She pressed her fists against her sternum and gasped and understood with horrible clarity that what she was feeling was his pain. Not her own, his. The bond. She had been avoiding the word, dancing around it, pretending the pull was just chemistry, just proximity. Just the strange biological side effect of spending her nights pressed against a cursed alpha king, but there was no pretending now. Not when his agony woke her from a dead sleep 2 floors away. Not when her wolf clawed at the inside of her skin with a desperation that bordered on madness, howling to reach him, to warm him, to hold the cold at bay. Saren lay in the dark and fought the urge to run to his chambers. He had sent her away. He had made it clear, and she would respect that, even if respecting it felt like swallowing broken glass. The days that followed were a slow unraveling. Saren returned to the kitchens. That had been the agreement, or rather the absence of one. Theron had dismissed her from the arrangement, and no one had offered an alternative, so she went back to the only place she had ever belonged. But the kitchen felt wrong now. The heat of the ovens that had once been her comfort felt thin and insufficient. The sweet smells of sugar and butter that had been her entire world now seemed flat and distant, like memories of someone else's life. Her hands, which had always been steady, now trembled when she tried to pipe frosting. Her focus fractured. Conversations slid past her without registering. And the cold followed her. It started in her fingertips. A subtle numbness she noticed while kneading dough on the second morning. By the third day, it had spread to her hands, and the head cook commented that her skin felt like she had been standing outside in winter. By the 5th day, Saren could see her breath in the kitchen, not the room's breath, hers. Everyone else was sweating in the heat of the ovens, and Saren stood among them exhaling frost. Something is wrong with you, the head cook said, eyeing her with concern. You need to see Vedra. Saren didn't go to Vedra. She knew what Vedra would say, and she was not ready to hear it. Instead, she worked. She baked obsessively, pouring everything she couldn't say and couldn't fix into pastry and bread and cakes she didn't care about anymore. Her body grew thinner. Her cheeks hollowed. She caught glimpses of Theron exactly twice. Once, crossing the courtyard, she saw him on the upper balcony. Even from that distance, she could see the damage. He moved stiffly, his skin ashen. A fur-lined cloak draped over his shoulders despite the warm afternoon. He did not look down, did not see her standing below, pressing her hand against the cold stone wall. The second time was worse. She was delivering a tray of pastries to a council meeting, her hands wrapped in cloth to hide the blue tinge creeping up her fingers. The council chamber doors were open a crack, and through the gap she saw him at the head of the table, and her heart stopped. He looked like death. His face was the color of candle wax. His eyes were sunken, rimmed with shadows so dark they looked like bruises. His lips were blue, and his hands resting on the table in front of him were shaking with a tremor he could no longer hide. Hadrian stood behind him like a shadow, and even the beta's carefully neutral expression couldn't mask the fear beneath it. Saren's knees buckled. She caught herself on the doorframe, and the small sound drew Hadrian's gaze. Their eyes met through the crack in the door. The beta looked at her, looked at the cloth wrapping her hands, looked at the frost crystallizing on the edges of the tray she was carrying, and his expression shifted from fear to alarm. He shook his head slightly, a warning, not now. Saren retreated on legs that felt like they might collapse at any moment. That evening, Vedra found her. The healer appeared in the kitchen doorway without announcement, took one look at Saren and said, "Come with me." It was not a request. In the healer's quarters, Vedra unwrapped Saren's hands and went very still. The blue had spread past her wrists. Her fingertips were nearly white. "How long?" Vedra asked. "Since he sent me away," Saren admitted. "You fool, why didn't you come to me?" "Because I already know what you're going to say." Vedra gripped Saren's hands between her own, chafing them as though friction alone could push back the cold. "This isn't sympathy pain. Your body is responding to an incomplete bond, Saren. A bond that formed whether either of you wanted it to, and the longer you stay apart, the more damage it does." "To me," Saren said. "To both of you." Vedra's voice was sharp with urgency. "His readings have plummeted. The curse has accelerated dramatically since you left. At the current rate of decline, he has weeks, not months, and you," she squeezed Saren's blue-tinged hands, "are developing sympathetic symptoms through the bond. His curse is reaching for you through the connection." Saren closed her eyes. "He won't let me help. He is the most stubborn man alive," Vedra agreed, "and he is going to kill both of you with his stubbornness." The word "both" landed like a stone in Saren's chest. "Both," she repeated. Vedra held her gaze unflinching. "If the bond remains incomplete and he dies, the trauma to your wolf will be severe, potentially fatal. You are tethered to him now, child. His death would drag you under." The room was very quiet. Saren looked down at her frozen hands and felt the truth of it settle over her like snowfall. "You could leave," Vedra said, her voice gentler now. "If you left the palace entirely, put enough distance between you and him, the bond might weaken. It's incomplete. There's still a chance it could dissolve on its own. And he would die. He might die regardless. But he would definitely die without me." Vedra's silence was confirmation enough. "I won't leave him," Saren said. And the words came out with a ferocity that surprised them both. "I don't care about the risk. I don't care about the bond, or the cold, or the curse. I am not going to walk away and let him freeze to death because he's too proud and too guilty to accept help." Vedra studied her for a long time. Then slowly she smiled. It was small and sad and proud all at once. "You love him," Vedra said. Saren's throat burned. She didn't deny it. "He will not let you back in willingly," Vedra warned. "Then I won't ask permission." Vedra squeezed her hands one final time. "Hadrian has already come to me. He's worried. If you go to him, he will help you reach Theron." Saren nodded, already rising, already moving toward the door. "Saren," Vedra called after her. She paused. "When you reach him, don't argue with him. Don't reason with him. He has spent years building walls of logic and duty to keep everyone at a distance. Logic will not break through. Then what will? Vedra's expression softened. The truth. Just tell him the truth. Saren found Hadrian in his office pacing. You took your time, he said. I was being respectful of his wishes. His wishes are going to get him killed. Hadrian stopped pacing. He collapsed last night. It took 2 guards to carry him to bed. The cold had spread to his chest. His heartbeat was irregular for over an hour. I need to see him. Tonight, after the palace sleeps, he handed her a small iron key, his chambers. He started locking the door, of course he had, even dying. Theron Valdris would rather bolt himself inside and freeze alone than let someone close enough to save him. Saren closed her fist around the key. Tonight, the corridors were dark and silent. Saren moved through them like a ghost, her bare feet soundless on the cold stone. The iron key pressed against her palm so tightly it left marks. The guards she passed nodded and looked away. Hadrian's doing. And she climbed the stairs to the upper levels, with her heart hammering so loudly, she was certain the entire palace could hear it. She reached his door. Her hand trembled as she lifted the key, and for one terrible moment she hesitated. He had told her to leave. He had made his choice. He had looked at her with those dark, devastated eyes and closed the door between them. And every logical part of her brain said that she should respect that. But logic had nothing to do with this. She turned the key. The room was dark except for the faint glow of embers in the fireplace. The cold hit her immediately, a wall of it, so intense it stole her breath. Frost coated every surface. The windows were opaque with ice. The tapestries on the walls were stiff and crystallized, and the air itself felt thick, like breathing through crushed glass. And in the center of the massive bed, barely visible beneath a mountain of furs, Theron lay motionless. Theron, Saren whispered. No response. She crossed the room quickly, her feet burning against the frozen floor, and pulled back the furs. Her stomach dropped. His skin was the color of winter sky, pale blue-gray, and his lips were dark with cold. Frost had gathered in his hair, along his lashes and the hollow of his throat. His breathing was shallow and slow. Each exhale a thin cloud of vapor that dissipated almost before it formed. He was freezing to death. Saren climbed onto the bed without hesitation. She pressed her hands against his chest, against the thin fabric of his shirt, and pushed every ounce of warmth she possessed into him. The cold fought back viciously, searing up her arms, clawing at her chest, trying to drag her under too. She gritted her teeth and held on. Wake up, she commanded. Theron, wake up. His eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharpening as consciousness returned. When he saw her face, something broke across his expression. Relief and anguish tangled together so thoroughly she couldn't separate them. Saren. Her name came out cracked and raw. You can't be here. I am here, and I'm not leaving. He tried to push her hands away, but his movements were sluggish, his strength drained by days of cold and sleepless nights. His fingers barely closed around her wrists before falling away. Please go, he said, and there was no command in it now, no royal authority. Just a man begging, please, I can't watch this curse touch you. It's already touching me. Saren pulled the cloth from her hands and showed him her fingers. Blue from the knuckle to the tip, frost gathered beneath her nails. It found me 2 floors away, Theron. It found me through the bond. His gaze dropped to her hands. The blood drained from his face, which should not have been possible given how little color remained. No, he whispered. Vedra says if we stay apart, the incomplete bond will kill us both, not just you, both of us. Her voice shook, but she held his gaze. So you can send me away as many times as you want, but it will not save me. It will only guarantee that we die separately instead of fighting together. I never wanted this for you, he said, and his voice shattered on the words. Any of it. The declaration at the feast was supposed to buy time. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary. I was never supposed to, he stopped. His eyes squeezed shut. Supposed to what? Saren pressed, leaning closer. Need you, he finished. Not like this, not this badly. I wake up reaching for you, and you aren't there, and I can't breathe. Your scent is in every room I enter, on every surface I touch, and each time I catch it my wolf tears at me because it knows, it has always known. And I have been fighting it because I thought if I kept you away, I could at least keep you safe. His hand came up slowly, trembling, and his cold fingers brushed her cheek. She leaned into the touch despite the chill. I am not safe without you, Saren told him. That's what you don't understand. The safety you're trying to give me doesn't exist. The only version of safe that works is together. Saren. I love you, she said. The words fell into the frozen room like sparks into kindling. Theron stared at her, his hand still against her cheek. His eyes wide and raw and so full of longing it hurt to look at him. You cannot love me, he said. I am cursed, I am dying. I am the man who burned Ashenmere and froze the world behind him. You deserve someone whole. I don't want someone whole. I want you. Why? The question was so bare, so genuinely bewildered, that Saren felt tears burn in her eyes. Because you apologized to a kitchen girl the first time we spoke. Because you gave me a book when you noticed I was bored. Because your ears turn pink when you're embarrassed. Because you hold me in your sleep, like I'm the most precious thing you've ever touched. Her voice cracked. Because I have spent my entire life being the person no one chose, and you chose me, Theron, in front of everyone. Without hesitation. And maybe you think it was strategy, but your wolf knew the truth before you did. He made a sound, a low, wrecked thing torn from somewhere deep in his chest, and pulled her down to him. The kiss was desperate and freezing and perfect. His mouth was cold against hers, his lips chapped and frostbitten, and she poured warmth into him through the contact. She felt the moment the cold cracked, felt it splinter and retreat as heat flooded through the bond between them, turning the trickle into a torrent. His hands found her waist, her back, her hair. She pressed herself against him, needing to be closer. If we do this, he said against her mouth. His breathing ragged, the bond completes. Do you understand that? It becomes permanent, unbreakable, my curse, my burdens, my enemies. All of it becomes yours. I know, Saren said. You will be bound to a man the court calls a butcher. I will be bound to a man who cried for the people he couldn't save. She kissed him again, fierce and tender. I know who you are, Theron. Not the title, not the rumors, you. Something inside him surrendered. She felt it through the bond, a wall collapsing, a door thrown wide. Years of isolation and self-punishment giving way like ice before a spring thaw. He held her so close, there was nothing between them but warmth, and the tenderness in his touch made her eyes sting. When the bond snapped into place, it was not gentle. It crashed through her like a wave. Golden and fierce, flooding every empty space she had ever carried, she felt him, his fear and his grief and his stubborn, boundless love, laid bare through the bond with an honesty no words could have achieved. He pressed his mouth to the curve of her neck, and the mating mark bloomed like fire beneath her skin, claiming her. She marked him in return, her lips against his shoulder, and felt the bond seal between them, permanent and unbreakable. Afterward, they lay tangled together in sheets that were no longer frozen. The frost on the windows was melting, rivulets tracking down the glass like tears. Theron held her against his chest, his arms wrapped around her with the fierce possessiveness of a man who had come very close to losing everything and knew it. His skin was warm. Not borrowed warmth, real, genuine, radiating warmth that she could feel pulsing through the bond. Your hands, he murmured. Lifting her fingers to his lips, she looked. The blue was gone, her skin was flushed and pink, warm to the touch. The bond, she whispered. He pressed his mouth to each fingertip, one by one, and the tenderness of it made her eyes sting. I should have chosen you properly, he said. Not in a crowded hall, not as a strategic maneuver. You deserved better than what I gave you. Saren pressed her palm against his cheek. The same gesture from weeks ago that had started everything. You said I will, when every other person in that room was laughing at me. She told him. I don't care about the reason, I care about the result. He turned his head and kissed her palm. I love you, he said. The words were quiet and rough and entirely new in his mouth, and she could feel through the bond that he had never said them before. To anyone. Ever. Saren smiled against his chest and let the warmth of it fill her completely. I know, she said. I've known for a while. He pulled her closer, pressed his face into her hair, and for the first time since the curse began, the Alpha King slept through the night without cold, without ice, without the frozen dead reaching for him from beneath the snow. But as Saren drifted towards sleep, warm and safe and whole in the arms of her mate, she felt something stir at the edge of the bond, a distant pulse of cold, faint but persistent, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. The curse was not gone, it was waiting. Saren knew the moment the frost came for them. She was dreaming of warmth, of Theron's arms around her, of the golden hum of the bond singing between their hearts, when the temperature plummeted. Not in the room this time, inside the bond itself. Her eyes opened to white, the frozen landscape stretched in every direction, vast and merciless and achingly silent. Snow covered the ground in a smooth, unbroken sheet. The sky above was the color of iron, heavy and low, pressing down like a lid on a coffin. And the cold was alive, not passive, not ambient, but sentient. Waiting, Theron stood beside her. Not the warm man she had fallen asleep holding, but the diminished version of him this place demanded. His shoulders were bowed. His face was stripped of every defense, every mask, every ounce of the authority that made him a king. He looked the way he must have looked at the end of the Ashenmere campaign, she realized. Hollow and broken, and carrying more dead than one man should ever have to hold. "You're here," he said. There was no surprise in his voice. "Only resignation. The bond brought me," Saren said. "We're connected now. Where you go, I go." He closed his eyes, and the pain that crossed his face was so raw it stole her breath. "Then you need to see," he said. "All of it." He walked, and she followed. And the frost revealed itself. The figures rose from the snow as they moved deeper. Soldiers encased in ice from the waist down. Wolves frozen mid-stride, then civilians, women and children and old men, standing in clusters, families holding one another. "The Ashenmere settlements," Theron said, his voice flat and dead. "The generals assured me the civilians would be evacuated. They were not." Saren reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "Not yet. You need to see her first." At the center of the frozen landscape, a woman knelt in the snow, untouched by ice, separate from the others. She was small and dark-haired with gentle hands, surrounded by bundles of herbs and strips of clean linen and a leather healer's kit worn soft with years of use. In her frozen hands, she clutched a sprig of dried lavender. "Neve," Theron said, and the name fractured in his mouth. Through the bond, the memory crashed over her. Neve, the only healer for 3 settlements, who had spent the entire conflict treating wounded from both sides. Who had been bandaging a fallen soldier when Theron's forces swept through. Who had called out that she was neutral, that she was only trying to help, and had been cut down by a soldier who didn't hear her, or didn't care. Theron had found her body afterward and knelt in the snow beside her, and understood what his war had cost. "She was helping," Theron whispered. "She was saving lives, and my army killed her because she was in the way." The ghost of Neve lifted her head. Her eyes were patient and sad, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every death the war had claimed. "A better king would have protected the innocent," she said softly. "A worthy man would have found another way." Saren watched Theron absorb the words, watched him accept them as truth, watched the guilt settle deeper into his bones, and she understood at last what Vedra had meant about logic not being enough. This was not a rational argument. This was a wound that had calcified into belief. 3 years of nightly visits to this place had hardened his guilt into something indistinguishable from identity. He didn't just feel responsible for these deaths. He had become the responsibility. It was all he was anymore. And the curse fed on that conviction like a flame feeding on oil. "Those aren't her words," Saren said quietly. "They're yours." Theron flinched. "The curse didn't create your guilt, Theron. It found the guilt you already carried, and it gave it a voice. Every night, it shows you the worst thing you've ever done and tells you it's all you are. And you believe it, because some part of you decided 3 years ago that you didn't deserve to heal." "I ordered the march," he said, his voice breaking. "I gave the command in a war you didn't start, against an enemy who refused peace. To protect thousands of people who would have died if you did nothing." She stepped closer to him, closer to the ghost, closer to the frozen center of his grief. "Neve died because war is monstrous, not because you are. You don't know that. I know you," Saren said, and her voice cracked. "Not the Butcher of Ashenmere, not the title, The man underneath, the one who worries about a kitchen girl's reputation more than his own survival. The one who asked me to help him and meant it. Who offered me a book because he noticed I was restless and then pretended he hadn't. That man is not a monster, Theron. He is a good man who did a terrible thing in a terrible situation, and he has been punishing himself ever since. Tears tracked down her face, freezing against her cheeks. I know what it feels like to believe you deserve the worst, she continued, her voice thick. I spent my whole life thinking I was abandoned because something was wrong with me. That if I'd been better, smarter, more lovable, someone would have kept me. I carried that for years, and it nearly ate me alive. She took his hands. They were so cold, so cold. But it wasn't true, Theron, and this isn't true either. You are not the sum of your worst moments. You are allowed to grieve for Neve and still choose to live. You are allowed to carry the memory of what happened and still believe you deserve warmth. She turned to face the ghost, this gentle woman with her herbs and her lavender, and said, He sees you. He has always seen you. And he is so sorry, but you have to let him go now. You both have to let go. No sound followed. The frozen landscape held its breath like the pause between heartbeats. Then Theron's fingers tightened around hers. I'm sorry, he said to Neve. Not the hollow repetition of endless guilt, but something different. Something that had surrender in it. I'm sorry I didn't protect you. I'm sorry my war took you from the people who needed you. I will carry your memory for the rest of my life. But I cannot stay here anymore. His voice broke on the last word. I cannot die here. The ghost of Neve looked at him for a long time. Then her gaze moved to Saren, to their joined hands, to the bond glowing between them like a thread of gold in the white. She smiled, small and sad and full of grace. The lavender fell from her hands. She dissolved into the snow like breath into cold air, and one by one the frozen figures around them began to thaw. The ice cracked and split and crumbled. The soldiers closed their eyes. The wolves lay down. The civilians released their grips on one another and turned away, fading into the white like ghosts, finding their way home. The snow began to melt. Beneath it, impossibly green. The first color Saren had ever seen in this place. Grass, tender and new, pushing up through the thawing earth. Theron collapsed against her, and she caught him, held him as the frozen grief of the Ashenmere War broke apart and poured out of him. He shook with it, great heaving sobs that racked his entire body, and she held on and let him fall apart, because sometimes falling apart is the only way to put yourself back together. I've got you, she whispered against his hair. I've got you. The frost dissolved around them. The white sky broke. Light poured through, warm and golden, and the frozen landscape melted away until there was nothing left but warmth and green, and the distant sound of running water. Saren opened her eyes. They were back in his chambers. The fire was blazing, bright and hot. Flames leaping high. The frost on the Itzer's hands had melted entirely, streams of water pooling on the stone sill, and Theron was warm in her arms. Truly warm, not borrowed warmth, not bond-sustained warmth, but his own. His skin was flushed with color, his breathing deep and steady. And when he opened his eyes, they were clear. Is it over? Saren asked, her voice barely audible. Theron pressed his forehead against hers. She could feel the bond humming between them, steady and strong and golden, and beneath it, where the cold had lived for so long, there was nothing but warmth. Yes, he said, the curse did not end like the snuffing of a candle. It faded the way winter fades, slowly and stubbornly retreating in inches rather than miles. Theron still woke some nights with frost on his skin and the echoes of cold places ringing in his ears. He still reached for her in the dark with the desperate grip of a man not entirely convinced the warmth would last. But the frost did not return, the frozen landscape, the silent dead, the iron sky, gone, dissolved like a fever breaking, leaving behind only the memory of how bad it had been, and the fragile, growing certainty that it was truly over. The healers confirmed what Saren already knew through the bond. Theron's body temperature had stabilized. His wolf was responsive and strong. The blue tinge that had haunted his skin had vanished entirely, replaced by the warm, healthy color of a man who was finally, stubbornly, grudgingly allowing himself to live. Vedra performed her final examination on a bright morning, 3 weeks after the frost broke, pressing instruments to Theron's skin with her customary efficiency, and then stepping back with an expression Saren had never seen on her face before. Satisfaction. The curse is dormant, Vedra announced. Whether it's truly broken or simply suppressed by the bond, I cannot say definitively. But the progression has stopped. Your readings are normal. Theron looked at Saren. She looked back. Normal, he repeated, as though testing the word. Don't get used to it, Vedra added dryly. You still have the constitution of a man who hasn't slept properly in far too long. Eat more, rest more, and for the love of everything sacred, stop reading reports in bed. The court's reaction to their bond was exactly as complicated as Saren had expected. A foundling baker as the Alpha King's bonded mate was not what the noble families had envisioned. The whispers followed her everywhere, sharp and persistent, and Saren felt the weight of every sidelong glance when their bond was announced formally to the court. Lady Ashworth called it a scandal. Lord Pemberton called it unprecedented. Lord Calder called it nothing at all. Having developed a sudden interest in his family's distant country estate and departed the palace entirely, Saren stood before the court on the day of the formal announcement, her chin lifted, flour probably still trapped beneath her fingernails. Theron stood beside her, his hand on the small of her back. When Lord Pemberton raised his objection about bloodlines, Theron listened to the full argument with the patience of a fair king. Then he said, "Noted," and moved on. Later, in the privacy of their chambers, Saren sat on the edge of the bed and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for weeks. "They hate me," she said. Theron removed his formal jacket and hung it precisely on the back of a chair. "They don't know you. There is a difference. A generous interpretation." He crossed the room and sat beside her. His hand found hers warm and steady. "They will adjust," he said. "And those who don't can take it up with their king, who happens to be unreasonably fond of his mate." Saren smiled despite herself. "Unreasonably. Embarrassingly," he amended. "Alarmingly. To a degree that his beta has described as, and I quote, a security concern." Saren laughed. And the sound filled the room in a way that still surprised her. That she could laugh here, that she belonged here. That the girl who had carried a birthday cake through these corridors with trembling hands and a broken heart now sat on the king's bed with his fingers laced through hers. "I want to keep baking," she said. Theron raised an eyebrow. "You are the queen consort." "I am a baker who happens to be the queen consort. I'm not giving up the kitchen." He looked at her for a long moment, and then the corner of his mouth turned up in that almost smile she had learned to treasure. "I would not dream of asking you to," he said. That night, Saren lay in Theron's arms and listened to his heartbeat, steady and strong and beautifully, mundanely warm. His hand rested against her hip, his thumb tracing absent patterns against her skin, and the bond between them hummed with a contentment so deep it felt ancient. "Theron? Do you remember what you said at the feast? When Calder was laughing and you stood up." His arm tightened round her slightly. "I said I will. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. She felt him thinking through the bond, turning the question over the way he turned over everything, carefully, thoroughly. "Because your hands were shaking," he said finally. "You were holding that cake, and your hands were shaking. And everyone in that room was laughing at you, and you did not drop it. You did not run. You just stood there, holding this impossible, beautiful thing you had built, and you refused to let them break it." He pressed his lips to her temple. "And I thought, if she can hold on, then so can I." Spring arrived slowly that year, as though the world itself needed time to thaw. Saren woke to warm light and the smell of new grass drifting through open windows. Beside her, Theron slept deeply, his face peaceful. One arm draped across her waist, with the possessive ease of a man who no longer feared what waited for him in the dark. She watched him for a moment. The way the morning light caught the angles of his face, the way sleep softened the lines around his mouth. No frost on the windows. No cold pressing in from unseen places. Just sunlight and birdsong and the steady rhythm of his breathing. She slipped out of bed carefully, pulled on a robe and padded down to the kitchen. The ovens were already warm. Flour waited on the counter in neat piles. And the apprentices were measuring sugar with the focused attention of people who had been told in no uncertain terms that the queen consort's kitchens was to be kept to exacting standards. Sarin tied on her apron, dusted her hands with flour, and began to work. The cake took shape beneath her fingers. 5 tiers, laced with honeycomb and wild lavender, because some things were worth repeating. But this one was different. This one had warmth baked into every layer, sunlight in the glaze, spring flowers in the frosting. And tucked between the second and third tiers, hidden from view, a small fondant wolf curled around a single golden flame. She carried it upstairs herself. Theron was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, blinking in the morning light, with the slightly bewildered expression of a man who had slept too well and didn't trust it yet. When he saw her in the doorway, holding the cake, flour on her cheek and sugar in her hair, he went still. "Happy birthday," Sarin said. He stared at the cake, then at her, and his expression shifted into something so tender and so full that it made her eyes sting. "You made this," he said. "I make all your cakes, that's the deal." He stood and crossed the room and took her face in his warm hands and kissed her. Long and slow and sweet, while the cake balanced precariously between them. "Don't drop it," she murmured against his mouth. "I will never drop anything you give me," he said, and she believed him.